whole bank nationalization thing does come to pass, do you think that Wells Fargo would be one of the banks that would end up being nationalized?
Well, let me point out that let's separate out a few things. I did a ticker on this morning. Okay, nationalization comes in a lot of different forms. There are people who would argue that what's gone on with the TARP so far with the injection of capital is de facto nationalization. In other words, the government has injected money and has an ownership stake. Okay, there are people that would argue that that constitutes nationalization, at least in part. What most people think about when they think nationalization is what happened in Sweden, where they literally seized the banks, went through, wiped out the shareholders, crammed down the debt to equity, and then sold them back into the public market. There's a problem with doing that in this case, especially in the United States. If you take, for example, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citibank, the three big ones that everyone's talking about and is worried about this happening with, there is roughly $1.5 trillion worth of debt on the books of those three companies between the three of them. Now, that does not count any off-balance sheet conduits and securitization stuff that may be hidden behind the curtain that we don't know about. And I can't put a number on that, but we know that Citibank, for example, has SIVs. I'm assuming Bank of America does. Wells may. All right, but I'm operating on the assumption that BAC probably does. I know Citibank does because they've disclosed it in the past. So here's the bottom line problem with this. It's the same reason that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are sitting off in this no man's land. If the government consolidates those firms onto the federal government balance sheet, it adds $1.5 trillion to the national debt instantly. All right, they become federal obligations at the point that happens. That's a major problem for us. People think, you watch Walker's movie, the IOUSA thing, you say, oh my God, $53 trillion worth of debt. There isn't $53 trillion worth of debt. There's $43 trillion worth of promises in the form of Social Security and Medicare. There's about $10 trillion worth of debt, but of that $10 trillion, it's actually up to 11 now. We put a trillion on, thank you, George Bush. But out of that, about half is held by the public in some form, whether it be China, whether it be investors in the United States, whether it be primary dealers. So call it $5.5 to $6 trillion. That's the actual public flow to the debt of the United States. If we were to put $1.5 trillion more on top of that, it would have an instantaneous impact on the sovereign credit rating of the U.S. and an instant impact on the bond market. The danger here, and this is why I think Nouriel Roubini and the people who are advocating this are just dead wrong. If we tried to do that kind of a thing, I am very concerned that we would run into a major problem with rolling over what amounts to our commercial paper. Over the last 5 years or so, the government has taken all of its longer-term obligations and has tried to cram them down in the short end of the curve. And they do this because it's much cheaper to borrow on 13 or 26-week or 52-week bills, or 4-week bills for that matter, the cash management bills, than it is to pay up for 30-year bonds or 10-year bonds. Okay, they have to pay a higher coupon in order to track that money. Well, the problem with this is that you become subject to the same risk as a company that needs to go out in the commercial paper market. If you can't roll that auction over for some reason, you're screwed immediately. So, this was the thing that got all these corporations all freaked out and Bernanke all freaked out in the fall, is that the commercial paper market locked up. We could very easily see a situation where all of a sudden the Treasury comes out with a 13-week auction and it doesn't subscribe. The consequence of that kind of a thing, when we're rolling over hundreds of billions of dollars a month, as we are doing right now, would be the instantaneous cutoff of funding for the federal government. The only thing the government could do in that situation in order to meet its own operating requirements would be to immediately shut down all Social Security and Medicare payments. That'd be the only place they could find the money. All right. You'd also end up with no money to pay the military with. I mean, essentially what you'd end up with is, when you look at the budgetary pie, that's the only place you can get the cash is from military, from Social Security, and from Medicare. There's just not enough left in the discretionary programs. So this is a major issue, and that's the danger of actually nationalizing these banks. So I don't see it happening. What I think is more likely is if we end up in a situation like this, that the proper thing for the government to do is to come in and cram them down, do a debt-to-equity cram down on these things, and spit them back out into the market. So essentially, if you're a debt holder and you have super senior debt, you're going to probably end up with equity. You're going to end up with stock. The existing stockholders have a zero. The preferred stockholders probably have a zero. The subordinated debt holders may get something. They may have some equity. Who knows? But we go down the capital structure. And if you get to the point that the entire capital structure is wiped out and there's still not enough money, then the FDIC just comes in and starts selling off assets and takes the bank into receivership. The reason this hasn't been done with any of these large firms is that, first off, you're going to trigger all the credit default swaps, right, which is their nightmare. They don't want that to happen. Secondly, the other issue you have is that this paper is everywhere. It's in money market funds. It's in pension funds. And a lot of these firms and funds that hold this stuff can't hold anything other than AAA debt. So if you go through and you do one of these cram downs and there's been no notice on this thing, I mean, look, hey, Moody's still calls some of this stuff AAA, right? Right? You do this kind of a cram down and it comes out of the middle of nowhere, you're going to end up with money market funds that break the buck all over the place. All right, you're going to have, the money market fund that you think is worth $1 a share is all of a sudden going to be worth 80 cents. And that, just causes spaz attacks within the political realm. But ultimately, if these banks get into a situation where capital just cannot be provided and we end up with a black hole kind of thing going on here, ultimately that's going to have to be done. There isn't really any other alternative. You can't take these things onto the balance sheet. There's too much debt there. You can't do it. The government cannot finance that kind of a thing. This is why it hasn't been done with Fannie and Freddie. Okay, Fannie and Freddie is a $5 trillion problem between the two of them. If you consolidate Fannie and Freddie onto the government balance sheet, it doubles the public float of the federal budget immediately. And that is the reason it hasn't been done. That's why they're throwing, $50 billion here, $20 billion there, $50 billion here. That's why it's being done that way. And they will keep that up as long as the bond market lets them. So that's what's going on. All right?